Dr. Eleanor Drage, the host of the Good Robot podcast. Join me as I ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism and other justice-seeking movements help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, there's a full transcript of the episode at thegoodrobot.co.uk, along with an especially curated reading list by every guest. I love hearing from listeners, so feel free to reach out on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, or through my Cambridge email address. And don't forget to leave a review on whichever platform you're listening from. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to this week's very special episode of the Good Robot podcast, where I'm interviewing Lisa Nakamura, the Gwendolyn Calvert Baker Collegiate Professor in American Culture. I'm talking to Lisa about her new book, The Inattention Economy, How Women of Color Built the Internet. We take a look at Tila Tequila, the internet's first influencer, the Navajo women circuit makers, and the Japanese and Japanese Americans who made Santa Clara Valley the beating heart of tech production. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm so excited to be speaking with you today, Lisa. I'm a huge fan and a bit nervous, and I really loved your book. It was phenomenal, and so pleased to be able to speak to you about it ahead of it coming out and being read by everybody else. A real privilege.
Yes, thank you so much for reading it.
So Lisa, can you tell us what do you do and what brings you to the topic of race, gender, and technology?
Oh, well, I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and I've been studying race, internet, identity, the culture that builds up around who people are and how they represent themselves since 1995, before there were images on the internet, before there was even really a web that people were using. And I'm just fascinated by how consistent some of the concerns around digital technology continue to be. So the controversies around artificial girlfriends and AI right now, people were talking about meeting their girlfriends or wives or boyfriends on the internet in 1998 as if that was a completely odd thing to do. So it's not as if moral panics or anxieties or fears that the world is coming to an end are new at all around questions of interpersonal relationships with real or imagined or artificial other beings. So that's been of huge interest to me ever since. And this book comes about because I wanted to know why it was that some of kinds of workers who made the internet possible have made computing possible, make it possible for us to buy devices at prices we can actually usually afford, are totally ignored, where other kinds of labor is unjustly and kind of inaccurately represented as being the reason we have nice things.
Our podcast is called The Good Robot. Given what you've just said just now, can there be good technology? Is it even possible? And if it were to be possible, how would we go about building it?
Well, I think clearly, given recent events, technologies like vaccinations are pretty important. Clean energy are pretty important. Those are absolutely pretty unambiguously good, even though the truth is being bent somewhat in this country to imply that they're not necessarily unambiguously good. I think with digital technology, it's such a mirror of the kinds of preoccupations and fears and paradoxes in U.S. society. And I will say U.S. because everybody else has to live with the United States' bad decisions. Right? Bad decisions, fantasy, sometimes good ideas. So I wouldn't say good or bad. I would say that digital technologies are somehow more symptomatic of the kinds of struggles that America is going through right now around what's work, who deserves credit for what kinds of identities and roles should stay the same. So the manosphere, trad wives, and what kinds of roles can change a little bit and to what extent can they change? So I was writing this just as COVID was receding and Black Lives Matter was being kind of, whipsawed between being an object of adoration to an object of vilification in a very, very short amount of time. And the internet was a technology that was reflecting that very, very much. So I think it's good for understanding what's happening in the kind of cultural imagination, even though we think of technology and culture as separate, clearly, definitely not.
It's interesting that you said at the beginning that vaccines are unambiguously good, and that we think perhaps that good technology has to be unambiguously good. There are always concessions that we make with different technologies. Actually calling this podcast The Good Robot, we didn't try too hard. We could have said excellent technology or perfect technology or something, but good is quite, and especially in the way that the English say good, it can mean quite mediocre.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, when I think of good, I think of biddable. A technology that can be responsive to what people want, but not always. So like good dog is a dog that usually behaves.
Right. Yeah. A good boy.
Yeah, exactly. I love British understatement. It's so great. If the British had made the internet, it'd be so different.
In what way?
I think that the level of literacy would be very different. There'd be more emphasis on text and a certain kind of sarcasm or wit, but maybe I'm just being stereotypical or something.
You think the hyperbole of the internet has something to do with American culture?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, definitely. I think so. I think that genres like reality television have been very much symbiotic with the internet, which is why I wrote one of my chapters about a reality TV star who started out as an internet influencer to kind of explain how someone can be both so visible. I'm talking about Tila Tequila. I know we're going to get to her later. Both incredibly visible and completely forgotten. So the paradox of being the most popular person on the internet and now somebody who everybody knows about, but no one knows anything about, to me shows not just the nature of fame in the new medium, but the way that women of color in particular are vulnerable to being exploited and dropped very quickly in the service of platforms which use their work and then discard them.
We'll come back to Tila, right, who is one of the icons of certainly my childhood. But to begin with, one of these groups of people that were so central to internet culture and yet have been discarded were Navajo women. So can you tell us about the Indian women circuit makers who produced circuits? They were told that it was part of the reproductive labor of expressing their culture, as in they should just be pleased to do it because it was a way of maintaining Navajo culture. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether they were compensated for their work or not. Yes. So can you tell us about these women?
Yes, I would love to. This is a chapter that covers the period between 1965 and 1975. So it's before the internet is really even going, right? And I started with it because a lot of writing about the internet really does start with the 90s, with Netscape, and sometimes with the 80s, with writing about DARPA and the development in the 70s. A network that would bring together distant places to transmit information between scientists, usually. I wanted to start in the 60s and 70s because the preconditions for computing were created by mostly women of color who sat over a microscope with tweezers, putting circuits together and testing them. Because the reliability rate for electronics used to be quite bad. I think most people don't remember. Of course they don't. But these things were made by hand. They were not yet as automated as they are now. And they weren't as reliable as they are now. So in 1965, the Fairchild Corporation opened a state-of-the-art plant in New Mexico in a part of the country that most people have never been, which is the Shiprock, the town of Shiprock, which is on a Navajo reservation. So they did this because they could produce chips that were needed for high reliability applications like the Apollo space mission, which could not have any failure on it, right? Below minimum wage. Because the Navajo Nation doesn't have the same requirements to pay minimum wage. It's a sovereign nation. Well, at the same time, being within the letter of the law of producing defense components within the U.S. border, right? So I was interested in this because there was 1,000 people working there. They were almost all Navajo women who had never had jobs before because there was no industry there before. So all this work is happening in a place where it's almost invisible to most people, right? And the main source of information sharing is still radio. Many people spoke Navajo. And the company itself was very, very invested in promoting this as an example of how enlightened they were and how well they were exploiting the natural traits of a people that they saw as being primitive, but at the same time, very, very meticulous, and in some ways fitting the stereotype of what later Asian factory workers were going to be. So quiet, docile, invested in craft. And at that time, this was seen as a racialized kind of quality and a gendered quality, that they made rugs, they made jewelry, therefore they would be good at making chips. And these things are completely opposite in terms of how they're done and why they're done and where people are sitting and how they're doing it. So I wanted to talk about this because it's another example of the disappearing, appearing woman of color in technology. So they were doing this work as a kind of precursor to the offshoring of almost all semiconductor and chip manufacture. Almost everything we make has been touched by an Asian woman in Malaysia or in China or some other country like that. Yet that investment and that labor of women of color is invisible. Sometimes it's hidden inside of a device, but a lot of the times it's just hidden in history. Like this incident was not written about much before I started exploring it. And I think it's because it's an anomaly, right? If we think about who made Silicon Valley possible, we think about men in garages and teenagers working in basements. We don't think about thousands of Navajo women or Malaysian women or what have you, painstakingly checking everything for 8 hours a day to make sure that we could have radios, TVs, and eventually computers.
Yeah, we just think of people with six-figure salaries in the present. And it's not taught in schools. This isn't on our history syllabus. It's not taught as part of AI literacy. That's just the ABCs of ChatGPT. And you call this the inattention economy. This is a way of showcasing what has not been paid attention to. And we hear a lot about the attention economy, right? But you are using a slightly different definition of attention to say, well, look, we need to pay more attention to these stories.
Yes, I think that a lot of the inequality that is at the kind of core of what the digital does springs from some somewhat obscure sources, and they're made obscure on purpose. So if we thought about actual hours spent on devices that we use or platforms that we use and who put them in, it's like people like content moderators, people like system administrators sometimes, or archivists, or people who are building things in factories. And the people who get the credit for it often have put very little in terms of their own time. So this is not to say we need to return to a kind of primitive idea about who made what as the only way we judge value. I think, however, we've gone way the other way, where just as in the 60s and 70s, women were thought to be natural factory workers because they were patient, that had small fingers. Conversely, I think white men are thought to be innovators because they have original ideas. So it's not to say that original ideas only exist in that realm, but they are somehow more sticky when we talk about white men than when we talk about, say, Asian women or Latinx men or anybody else, pretty much.
Yeah, and Carrie and I, my previous co-host, did a lot of research into what it takes to come up with an original idea. In a company, what do you need to file a patent? You need space, the time to think. You need someone to listen to you, to perceive your idea as original, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all tied into this broader kind of capitalist economy of ideas. Anyway, I want to get on to this other aspect of the story of Navajo women that you tell. You don't shy away from the elements of these stories that complicate and enrich what you call, a straightforward narrative of economic exploitation and unacknowledged labor. For example, how many women took great pride in supporting their families. And I said in a previous little clip that I did for The Good Robot and Cambridge social media a while ago that when my granny was working in Bletchley Park and, she told everyone and then continued to tell everyone that she was a secretary, when in fact she was what was called a computer. So one of the women who were cracking the Enigma code. So that sort of hidden history seems to me is like real exploitation. But to her, of course she wouldn't say what she was doing. And, she was working in service of the country and she was very proud of it. So, there's a clash of feminisms between generations that's at stake there as well.
I love that story. And here you are doing this, right? So I think there are genealogies of investment and labor to build technologies that come from unexpected places and from unexpected people. And sometimes are made obscure, as you say, for practical reasons, right? I mean, there are security concerns around cryptography that made it so that she couldn't go around telling everybody in the world she had done this. I think sometimes these are somewhat willful omissions, however, because they do question this idea of who deserves credit and who deserves compensation for different kinds of labor. So in the book, I talk a lot about the AOL volunteer lawsuit that America Online, which people my age will remember well, was started by some, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, but the people who actually got it to run were often volunteers. There are people who gave help for free. They did homework, tutoring. They taught people how to log on. They gave them companionship. They explained how things worked. And these were mostly women and kids. And they were paid in AOL hours. So this is a kind of weird echo of the way that factory towns worked, where you would be paid in script, right? Not in actual money that you could only spend in that factory town. And people were glad to build the community. They really had this utopian idea. They were helping people to come together across distance and across identities and barriers and build a kind of utopian space. And I will say that they did that in many ways, but they were not given profits. They were not even paid. Some of them were told they might get jobs in the company, but pretty much no one did. And then everyone was fired on the same day because AOL realized that they were probably, well, many reasons, but one of them was that they're probably violating child labor laws because many, many of those volunteers were children. I know. So, that's the kind of flip side to the idea of the child boy genius in the basement, right? There's like a retired woman or a 12-year-old girl who was spending 80 hours a week on AOL, right? Teaching people how to log on and stuff. So that story has a somewhat happy ending in that the lawsuit was successful and community leaders got, $30-something million. But it was well after the fact, 20 years, and not everybody who had done this could be located anymore. So one of the arguments I'm making in this book is that, acknowledgement and apology is not really enough. It is possible to repay people money for the time they put into building platforms so that all the profit doesn't just trickle up to a few people, which is really, we know, one of the problems with Silicon Valley.
Before we get into reparations, because I think that's a really important part of your book, let's talk about the Japanese and Japanese Americans that made Santa Clara Valley the beating heart of tech, what is now called Silicon Valley. And they were recruited from internment camps. And you tell this amazing story of your family members where you've got your maternal grandmother, Misao, who was sent from LA to do electronics work that mimicked the form of the camp as well. So it's not just the internment camps, it's how the culture of the camp is replicated then in later tech production scenarios, and why these companies were so invested in young women, 35 and under.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a fascinating story. This came out of some archival research I was doing in old Japanese American newspapers. So like many ethnic groups, like Chinese and in Europe, Jews, right? They had their own newspapers that were both in Japanese and in English. So there were Yiddish English newspapers, German English newspapers. So this one was called the Rafu Shimpo, and my grandmother used to get it. So I'd see it on the table. I'd think, oh, what's this? I can't read it. And some of the classified ads in the 60s and 70s were for electronics workers. So, during this period, people had come back from the war and they were reading these newspapers and looking for jobs because they'd been incarcerated, sometimes for up to 3 years. My family on my dad's side was only there for a year. They were in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, behind a barbed wire fence, right? Living in a barracks with 3 other families. And some of the jobs were for airline attendants. Some of them were for data entry. So they're really interesting, like how they're describing these new information jobs. And some of them wanted military experience. So my grandmother applied for a job as an assembler. I don't think she found it from the ad. I think she found it from an employment agency. And they wanted women 35 and younger. And she was 50. And she got that job because they weren't really checking people's ID. But the idea was that here was a group of people who were vulnerable because they had lost everything. People who had farms didn't have farms anymore. They now had to rebuild from scratch. And the stereotype, again, of like Asian women as being quiet, non-political, right? They weren't agitators for equal rights usually. I really fed into this idea they'd be great assembly workers. And this was in Silicon Valley and Los Angeles. So, California. So I found some of this work by looking at traditional archives like newspapers. I found some of it by looking at things that my uncle left me when he passed away because he saved everything. So this is a great example of how you can kind of don't shy away from using your own personal history, right? Because sometimes you have artifacts which just don't exist in the public record, either because they're about a group that no one thinks is very important or because archives are very opportunistic. Whoever tends to donate them or maintain them is what we get in there. So I think someone like Tonia Sutherland, who's a professor at UCLA, writes very well about Black archives and what doesn't make it into those. It's very, very political. But as researchers, I feel we get this great luxury of being able to have time to look at less traditional material.
And it's a really beautiful example of how to do autoethnographic work that my students are often asking, how do I do this? I've got this that, someone in my family did and I'd love to write about it. How do I enter history of tech development over time? So if you're listening and that's what you're doing, another great reason to read this book. Right. Quickly, tell us about her son, Hiroshi Joe, worked at Birdseye as well. And it's so interesting. This is a staple American frozen foods company. If you're listening and you don't know what Birdseye is, what's the relationship with those kind of staple US industries then and internment and electronic labor in the US?
Yeah, this is a story I didn't know about until after my uncle died during COVID. So he was born before internment. And so when everybody had to go live in a prison camp during the war, he was already 8 or 9 years old. And after the 3 years my mother's side of the family spent in camp, they didn't have money to go back to California. They were pretty poor. They didn't have a farm. They were LA people. So the Birdseye Farms, which is located in New Jersey in Seabrook, offered to go to camp and take everybody who was there on a bus to New Jersey and give them jobs. So they were kind of going in the opposite direction of where they wanted to go. They wanted to go back west, but they ended up going east. And they lived there for 5 more years in another camp. Only these camps were called dorms. And they were full of displaced people. So it wasn't all Japanese Americans who were poor. There were some refugees in there, some even German refugees, interestingly, who ended up there. So pretty much people who couldn't find professional jobs and couldn't afford to go anywhere else. And his Social Security card, which is how I saw this, said on it, Dorm A, Seabrook Farms. And I thought, wow, he doesn't have a home per se, but also his home is basically a camp again. So they got out of camp, but in some ways they were still there. And it took them 8 years to get back to Los Angeles, where they ended up living in a neighborhood very much like they had been in the Rampart area. So this isn't to say that this was a typical experience, right? But it does show how incarceration often does lead to consequences that kind of reverberate, right? Because that side of the family really didn't end up participating in the digital economy like my dad's side, because they moved right back to Santa Clara County, which was, as you say, the beating heart of what was happening. And my dad went to work for ITT in Fairchild. So when I wrote about the Fairchild factory, I already knew a little bit about it because of him.
Fairchild was apparently one of the first chip manufacturers to outsource production to Asia.
Yes.
And it's kind of crazy to think of a time before that, that outsourcing of this particular kind of work. So what does that pivotal moment tell us about race and the internet?
Oh, it's everything, right? I mean, that's the path of colonization, is always towards the cheapest and often most distant form of labor, so that when things don't work right, no one has to see it and no one has to know about it, right? So I was surprised to find that so many chips were made in places like San Rafael and Maine. So San Rafael, California, Maine, Mexico as well, right? On the border, there was a lot of chip manufacturing. My father's friend, who was an exec in Silicon Valley, said he saw a company convert a bowling alley into a chip manufacturer in Maquiladora. But the cheapest place was Asia at that time. So moving everything to the cheapest place became the logic of Silicon Valley. And I mean, it's the logic of lots of companies and lots of industries. But Silicon Valley was really one of the first to make it exclusively women, almost exclusively women, and almost exclusively one region. So it's very difficult for people who don't like labor conditions to strike and be heard when they're halfway across the world. And we've seen a lot about like bad labor conditions. And now places like Nigeria, where AI data cleaning is happening and content moderation is happening, people are having to quit those jobs because of PTSD, and people are even, Samasource and others were canceling contracts because the work is so dangerous and so difficult. So this outsourcing of everything, right? Dirty work in the terms of physical work, but also dirty work, like psychologically and emotionally, is often not happening here. But we're definitely benefiting in some ways from it happening in other places.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And the same goes for recycling and other sustainability initiatives that make it seem to us like our countries, our wealthier nations, are getting cleaner and actually at the expense of the countries where our waste is being exported to, etc.
That's perfectly put, right? Yeah.
It's a kind of game of whack-a-mole, right? Where, you think that you're getting somewhere and actually the problem just pops up somewhere else, which is why activism could be so difficult. Because if you're saying, let's make this cleaner, at what cost does it come and to whom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's what imperialism does. It moves things around. It makes things more visible and other things less visible, partly to kind of cut off resistance right out the gate, right? People can't protest about what they don't know. But it's not new, right? It's like the logic of the 17th and 18th century to move things we want, like rubber, away from places where we don't want people to have things, right? Or, extreme forms of oppression are possible and often common.
Absolutely. Before we end with these stories of Fairchild and the Navajo women, why do we need to look, do you think, at what the main characters of your book were doing outside of the factory, the lab, and the platform? Why do their stories matter in the history of computing?
Well, I think I wanted to do something to counter the tendency we have to fetishize the lives of famous innovators, where intense detail and intense attention is paid to every aspect of their life. Like, where did Bill Gates go to high school? How many hours did he spend practicing the piano? Like, these things are really scrutinized and even seen as models for how other people ought to live their lives. Like Malcolm Gladwell has done this, right? I think we need to pay as much attention to people whose lives are just as imbricated and just as, in many ways, responsible for the wonders and utopian aspects of the technologies that we have. So that's kind of like just a poke in the eye. Like, why are we doing this for one group and not another? But the other is to understand the conditions of production for things. So what does it mean that so many of the early electronics we had were made by people who were never going to be able to use them? What kinds of ideas did they have about what they were doing and why they were doing it? So some of the Navajo women I talked to did know that they were making components for rockets and for the space program. And they were told that by the engineers and factory supervisors who wanted them to work harder. So the idea that people can be motivated to build the nation or to benefit other people is often why people do it. So many Filipina content moderators who other people have studied have said, I know what I'm doing is painful and hard for me, but I want to make the internet nice for other people. Like, I'm aware that this is a sacrifice I'm making for other people. And this is very much a formation that attaches to femininity. It's not something you see as much around the ways we think of masculinity and technology. And so that's why I was so interested to be on your podcast. I feel like you talk about that all the time.
Yeah, it's, care labor is very well theorized in feminism. The idea that if you care for something, you're thinking of something beyond yourself, right? There's an altruism that, men perhaps don't get because they're certainly the men in the tech space aren't considered as empathetic, right? And empathy is something that's outsourced and also racialized. I think on that note, you talk a lot about redefining or thinking about the definition of what a person of color is in the book. So can you tell us, where did that term actually come from? Because it hasn't come from nowhere, and it's not a super old term. And you said that grandmother wouldn't necessarily have identified as one, which is kind of interesting. So can you tell us about that?
I was interested in the tendency academics have to call people things they would never call themselves. So when we talk about people as political subjects, hardly anyone's going to claim that identity. They really don't know what that is. It's really a convenient way for us to talk about people in ways that serve what we're trying to do. So the woman of color term came to my consciousness from actually looking at Tumblr in the late teens and seeing how many people, young women, like Gen Z women, were claiming woman of color identities. So you'd see hashtag WC, hashtag woman of color. And I hadn't seen that used that much since I read This Bridge Called My Back, which used that term a lot. And this was many, many years ago. It's a woman of color anthology. So I wanted to know why it was returning, what the uses of it were for young women, especially who had been raised with the internet. So some of my grad students will say, or just students earlier would say, like, I was raised on the internet, meaning they didn't remember a time when they had not had it as a thing to use, yet at the same time, it was not monetized the same way it is now. So they might remember Facebook before ads, or they might remember Tumblr before it was acquired. And, while it was still kind of wild space for queer identity and radical ideas and, new kinds of feminism that wanted to be intersectional, right? Wanted to be inclusive of people who of different races, genders, and global identities. So I did a little research into where it came from. Loretta Ross, who is a Black activist, talks about how it came about because the Black Women's Caucus had a platform they wanted to present in Washington, and other non-white women wanted to be part of it. And so the term woman of color was invented, but it's not like anybody loved it necessarily. It was because they had a common political agenda that they were trying to achieve. So it's problematic. I think if you're African woman from Africa, you're a part of your own majority in your group. You don't see yourself as a woman of color. So it's weird because it orients itself around whiteness still, which is not the best. Nonetheless, what am I trying to say? I think it came back, and I did a Google search to see when it was being searched for the most. And it was in the 2020 period, which was also around the time of Black Lives Matter, right? So there is a big kind of global interest again in racial justice and feminism too, new kinds of feminism. So political engagement among women of color is higher than it is among other groups, right? Yet at the same time, a lot of women of color wouldn't call themselves that, which I think is legitimate and good. So seeing the new energy around this term really energized me to want to explain it better, right? And to see why it is this particular group of people, whether or not they want to call themselves that, have been the bedrock of what we call the tech industry.
You've been listening to The Good Robot and our interview with Lisa Nakamura. For the second half of this interview, please head to our next bonus episode. This episode was made possible thanks to Stiftung Mercator and the Littlejohn Trust. It was written and produced by me, Dr. Loretta J, and the editor of this week's episode is credited in the episode's description. Thanks for listening.